Hey, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about how to write the introduction of your paper and a little bit about the conclusion. We'll be covering material from both books today, so we'll be going over quite a lot of stuff. I want to start out with an idea from a book by Heath and Heath called Made to Stick, and it's also covered in Schimmel chapter 3. The idea is that some ideas are sticky. Some stories are sticky. Sticky here means that the reader or the listener will remember them. They stick in their minds. And that's certainly something you want your paper to be. You want it to be sticky. The idea was that for an idea to be sticky, it has to have 6 elements. And they had this success framework. Okay, so the letters here stand for simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and stories. Okay. And so let's go over what these means, keeping in mind how they're going to apply to your paper. So simple. Okay. Simple ideas are easier for readers to digest and are easier to remember. Okay, so here's some example of a couple of simple ideas that are really sticky. You know, they are powerful and people remember them. So one is the "build the wall" quote from a presidential candidate, and another is from Albert Einstein: E equals mc squared. Okay, so these are both very simple ideas. Even though there's, for example, behind E equals mc squared, there's obviously a lot of work and a lot of depth, but on the surface, right, it's described using one equation with two variables rather than a whole paragraph to make sense of it. How this translates to your paper, for example, you might say, we develop an algorithm to solve X, and we develop an evaluation framework for Y. So this is not as simple as just saying we develop an algorithm to solve X. And a reader is more likely to remember what your paper is about if you give them something simple, like we develop an algorithm to solve X. Whereas here you add on more information and you actually make the idea less sticky, make the notion, the results of the paper a little less sticky. Okay. One thing to remember is simple does not need to be simplistic. Okay, so here's the difference between the two. One is a policy that's probably not thought through very well. The other is something that has years of work behind it. So this is an example of a simple but not simplistic. Okay, so it's not bad to be simple in this way. The second element, the U, stands for unexpected. Okay, and that's something that also kind of triggers our memory and makes us interested as readers if there's something unexpected in what we are hearing. Okay. And this applies to writing research papers as well. You should try to identify and highlight what about your work is unexpected. A common common thing you might do is to highlight a knowledge gap or a method gap that your work closes. We'll be returning more to this later, but a knowledge gap is basically something we don't know and it would be interesting to know. Okay? Or a method gap is something that we cannot do currently, but would be nice if we were able to do it. And if it's not obvious that it can be done or it can be known, then sort of unexpected to say, hey, yeah, we were actually able to find something out here. So here's an example. It is important to have a method that does X, but most people expect that such a method would be too slow to be of any use. In this paper, we develop a method for X and show that it turns out to be fast enough for most applications. Okay. The way you set this up here, the language you used, made this turns out to be fast enough, made it unexpected because you here set up that most people don't think it's possible. Now, you didn't have to do this, if you didn't have to write this, and in that case you would have lost some of the unexpected element and some of the stickiness of your story. If you see good papers, they often will do something like this. They'll say, well, you know, it's generally believed that X, And then later they say, well, actually, we found something different. The third element of a sticky story is is a concrete. Okay, so readers really um, um, do better with concrete examples rather than abstractions. So sometimes it's necessary to give something abstraction, but then you can make it more concrete. For example, you might say, our method X is an improvement over some previous methods. Whatever those are, you put them here. Okay. So that's an abstract notion, and it tells it says what you want to say, but it's not as sticky as saying, for example, we ran X and found 56% improvement over method Z on dataset Y. Okay, here you've made this more concrete, and that's something people are looking for, and will stick out in their minds as they read your paper. The fourth element of success is credible. Okay, and people have to believe you what you're saying. Okay? And in our work, the way you do that is you ground your ideas in previous work, especially using citations. Okay, so you use citations to cover what's already known and explain how what you're doing relates to what you already known. And then your reader will say, okay, this isn't just somebody from the sky that did something. This is somebody that knows the literature, so they probably know what they're talking about. Another thing you need to do is describe your methods clearly. If I get to reading your methods as a reader and it's not clear to me what you did, I lose confidence that your results are believable, and you lose that credibility. The fifth element of success is emotional. Okay, and this is maybe a little surprising in computer science. You don't think of your papers as being emotional, but curiosity is a big emotion. Okay, and if you engage with if you create a story that engages with this emotional factor, with the reader's curiosity or something else, the story will stick better in their minds. And the way we can engage with curiosity is, for example, to ask a novel question or an engaging question, something people will go, oh, right, I wonder, yeah, we don't know that. That would be cool to know. Okay, and this is often a deciding factor in papers when they're being reviewed for a conference, and everything else is good, is solid, lots of papers to choose from. But your paper got somebody kind of excited. They're like, oh, this is cool. If they can say that this is cool, that helps the paper, maybe differentiates that paper from all the other very good papers as well. And the last element is story. So your paper has to be a story. You're telling a story. Now, yes, it's not a fairy tale. It's this very specific kind of story with its own rules and so on. But there's a narrative. There's a reader who actually might be interested or might lose interest. And so that's really important to think of what you're writing as telling a story. Now, this brings us back to the notion of the reader, and we had this slide, I think, first lecture, and I want to refresh who your readers are. Okay. So I put them roughly here into 4 categories. So one is the dedicated reader. This is maybe an expert in your field, maybe a student who's also working on a similar problem. They're reading in detail what you wrote, and for them, they're going to remember things even if you don't have this stickiness, because they're really motivated readers and they're really interested in all your details. Then there are time-bounded dedicated readers. Okay, they are interested in the details of a paper, but they have a fixed time to understand what you're doing, like 1 or 2 hours. So for example, this would be a faculty in your area who's like, oh, that's a cool paper. I was thinking about that problem. Let me see if it's something interesting. Okay, and they will dedicate 1 hour. Maybe someone will dedicate 15 minutes. Someone will dedicate 2 hours to read your paper. Okay, but they're not going to spend weeks if they don't understand something digging into what you did. Okay, so they're sort of half motivated, and if they read the intro and they're like, oh, I guess this is not as interesting as I thought, they're not going to necessarily go on to read the rest. Then you have reviewers, and reviewers are reading your paper carefully, hopefully, but often on a tight schedule. So they have 10 papers to review, and they're trying to be very time efficient. And so they may also spend 1 or 2 hours, but unlike your time-bounded dedicated readers, reviewers are often adversarial. So they're looking to make a judgment about your paper and looking for reasons to not like your paper. So this is often the case, right? That it's as soon as as a reviewer, as soon as you find kind of a major flaw with the paper, you can already write your review saying, okay, there's a major flaw, and you don't have to worry about all the details. And then there are most readers. They skim through your paper rather than reading it thoroughly. And they're just, initially they may be just looking, is this a relevant paper to cite? Okay. And they're kind of looking, is this interesting paper? If they, in the skimming, they find something they're interested in, then they may switch to become a dedicated reader or a time-bounded dedicated reader. All right, so that's just a recap of the type of readers broadly that you might expect. Of course, this isn't like a rocket science. This isn't a scientific breakdown of the readers, but sort of rough categories for you to think about. And that's really important for in the intro. This is where you really either capture your reader's attention or you don't. And this is where a lot of readers form their first and lasting impression of the paper. So you need a story to get them interested, and that's why those success elements are important. You need to motivate your readers to keep reading and reading carefully, and you need to meet their expectations about the structure and content of the paper. So if in your field it's customary for the intro to have a certain structure, then you need to keep that structure. If you're kind of advanced, you can kind of play with deviating from it, but you do so at your own risk. Okay? Because people, especially when they're skimming through the papers, they're saying, okay, this I expect to see in the method section. This I expect to see in the intro. So they're going to those places, and if they don't find what they're looking for, they may write in your review, oh, he or she, they didn't include this part, even though maybe you did, but it was not in the place that they were expecting. So to do all of this, the first thing you need to have a good grip on is to know what the reader knows. And here there's an interesting concept of schemas. Schemas are kind of ideas, frameworks that people have. And so a way to say what I'm saying is that you need to know your reader's schemas. Okay, what do they bring here? Okay, so your story needs to build on top of existing schemas. Okay, and add something new that the reader doesn't know. Okay, and the reason it's really important to understand your reader's schemas is if you jump too much, if you assume they know something that they don't, then they're not going to understand the significance of what you're doing. They're maybe not even going to understand what you're saying. Okay. On the other hand, if you re-explain things that your readers already know, then they'll get bored and they'll miss the main point. They'll be like, okay, this paper is just talking about things I already know. It's also very powerful to, if you know your reader's schemas, to make use of them to make your ideas, for example, simple. Okay, here's an example of a hypothetical paper that did a study about how alligator meat tastes. And so one way they wrote their results is, alligator meat is a light-colored, finely textured meat with very little fat. It cuts easily and is moist if not overcooked. The flavor is mild. So this is not a simple idea. So there's a lack of stickiness about it. But if the writer understands that there is a schema they can use of the reader, and that's most people know how chicken tastes. So the writer can build upon that and say alligator meat tastes like chicken, but a little meatier. When you read this, it's much simpler, and it's a much more sticky idea. And the way you got here is you understood that there is a schema of the reader that you can use. Okay, so going back to this notion of a story, you need to not only understand what your reader schemas are, but more broadly, how the community in which you're working, the research community, how it's going to look at what you did. In other words, how what you're doing fits into existing community efforts. How your work fits in with everything else that's going on right now or that's been done. And this is admittedly hard to do for newcomers to the field, and that's why you have your advisor who can help you a lot here. To do this, you need to understand the bigger questions that your field is pursuing, that other researchers are interested in, and how your work connects to them. Okay, it's not, none of us are, well, most of us are not working on the P equals NP problem. There's a subproblem of a subproblem that you can say, well, if we solve this, then it's going to kind of be a building block for these other questions that eventually lead to the big question of the field. Okay, so you need to understand how to make these connections. Okay. What is often a mistake that happens is people think of a paper saying, well, I did some work. Okay, it was interesting. I got some interesting results. So I'm gonna write like a report of the topic that I did and what results I got. Okay, those are poorly written papers. And here's an example of an intro, of a very short version of an intro that has this problem. And we'll be using this example later, so I'll go through it here. When college students go out and relax on the weekend, many now binge, downing several alcoholic drinks quickly until they're drunk or even pass out. It is behavior that has been spreading through colleges and universities across the country, especially at large state universities. It once was done mostly by men, but now even women binge. It has drawn the attention of parents, college administrators, and researchers. Okay. So what this does is introduce a topic, okay, which is fine. You have to do that, but it doesn't tell me why I should care about this. So what? This is the big question that your reader has, and you should be thinking that your reader is always asking, so what? Okay. Now, it may be obvious to you, so what? You know, that it's not good, blah, blah, blah. But what's obvious to you is not obvious to your reader, right? You've thought about, if you've did the study, you probably thought a lot about binge drinking, and so it's obvious to you, so what? You need to spell it out for the reader in your paper. Who cares that college students drink a lot? I mean, isn't that just part of the college experience, right? Like someone could just say this, right, and think this. So instead of just passing on information that interests you, think of yourself as solving some problem or meeting some challenge. Okay, so it has to be a problem, it has to be a challenge, and then you can explain to your readers why they should care about it. Okay, this answered their so what question, so what. Okay, and this goes into making an element, making the paper sticky, right? Maybe it goes together with making the paper sticky. Now, so this breaks down into 4 components, and depending on the book you read, they'll have different names. So the first component of the story, of an introduction or the whole paper, is a shared context or an opening. So what you just read about binge drinking is a good shared context example or opening. It tells us the characters, it tells us the relevant previous knowledge that the reader should have, and kind of gives the world in which your contribution lives, right? So it talks about college campuses and binge drinking in general. The second part is the statement of a problem, or as Shimo calls it, a challenge. What do your characters need to accomplish? What specific questions do you propose to answer? What knowledge gap or method gap do you propose to address? Okay, so these are sort of different ways of looking at the same thing, depending on exactly what type of writing you're doing. In your writings in computer science, it's usually it's probably a method gap very often, but it's sometimes a knowledge gap or just a question that you propose to answer. Then there's the statement of the solution, or Shimo calls it action. Okay, and this is what is the work that you did to address the challenge. Okay, so that's actually most of your paper, the methods, the results. This is part of the action. And finally, there's the resolution. What's changed as a result of your action? So, okay, you've now developed a method for X, so what? Okay, and here you should probably tie in back to your challenge and opening. Okay, but you can go a little further than that. We'll see in a second how that happens. So your paper doesn't have sections called opening, challenge, action, resolution. Your paper has its own structure. Often it has an IMRAD structure, which is introduction, methods, results, and discussion and or conclusion. Okay. So there's a way that naturally maps the opening, challenge, action, resolution elements to this structure of the paper. And this tends to vary between fields, but not that much. Okay. So in the introduction, we have a long opening, a long challenge, and a short action. We might have a paragraph at the end of the introduction summarizing what we did. Then the methods and results is this very long action, right? We are really going into a lot of detail. And then discussion and conclusion, we don't go over the opening and challenge. We don't go over the opening at all. In the challenge, we just kind of repeat a short version of it, and we repeat a short version of the action. And here's where we have our long resolution. All right. So we'll go through the introduction first in a lot of detail and briefly talk about the discussion and conclusion. Okay, so ideally we would be looking at full-length introductions of papers, but those are very long, and so it's going to be hard to look at, to go over more than just one example. So instead we have these condensed examples, so a very condensed version of introduction that sort of covers the basic elements, but without a lot of details. So here's back to the binging example. Okay. In red, you're going to see the opening or the shared context. Then in blue, you'll have the statement of the problem, and the solution will be stated in light blue here. Alcohol has been a big part of college life for hundreds of years. From football weekends to fraternity parties, college students drink and often drink hard. But a new kind of drinking known as binge drinking is spreading through our colleges and universities. Bingers drink quickly, not to be sociable, but to get drunk or even to pass out. And here we go to the challenge, to the problem. because so far we've just give the shared context. Binging is far from the harmless fun long associated with college life. In the last 6 months, it has been cited for at least 6 deaths, many injuries, and considerable destruction of property. It crosses the line from fun to reckless behavior that kills and injures not just drinkers but those around them. We may not be able to stop binging entirely, but we must try to control its worst costs by educating students in how to manage its risks. So here we see a solution that's being proposed, which is educating students. Let's look at the different types of shared context that one may have. And using this example, you can just write it in many different ways. So one shared context is a historical background. This is what we just read, that alcohol is a big part of college life, and college students drink and drink hard. But you could have the shared context as a recent event. For example, a recent survey showed that 80% of first-year students engaged in underage drinking in their first month on campus, a fact that should surprise no one. Or you could have a shared context which is based on a common belief. Most students believe that college is a safe place to drink for those who live on or near campus, and for the most part they are right. But for these students, blah blah blah. Okay. So you could see that there are really so many different ways to start here. You need to start with something that's common to everyone, that's a shared context, and you need to bring out from that the surprise twist, the but. All of these red guys are then followed by a but, and this is still part of the shared context, but it has this remember this unexpected element. This is where it often comes in, right? So you have a shared context, but then you say but. You challenge that context. You say, well, but that's not always the case, or like, but there's a new kind of drinking. Okay, but there's something worrisome. Okay, so this is nice. It captures your reader's attention. Now in computer science, your shared context is often, it's where you can ground what you're saying in previous work. But the important thing is in the shared context is you should be relating to things that people know already, right? So it's about reader schemas. So if you start with a shared context that your readers actually didn't know, oh wait, college students drink, I didn't know that. So if a reader starts like this, then they're totally going to lose the thread of the significance of what you're going to say. Okay, so it's important when you're writing your introduction and giving your shared context that you know those reader schemas and you connect to them, in thereby connecting to what your starting point, what everybody knows, and then slowly building it towards the problem that you're going to state. So what are some common mistakes then in how people do the shared context? One mistake is misdirection. I see this happen all the time. In fact, I've done it. I see it. I see myself doing this as I'm editing my drafts, and hopefully by my final draft, I get rid of this problem. So here's an example of a misdirection. Algorithms for problem X have tended to be slow, too slow for most applications. Okay, and then I give some examples. Another concern has been their memory consumption. They often cannot run on a typical server. In this paper, we develop a memory-efficient algorithm for X. So the reason this is misdirection is because in the end, your solution has to do with memory efficiency. Okay? Whereas initially you're talking about speed, slow. Okay? So as someone is reading this, they're thinking, oh, we're talking about speed, and you're setting up an expectation that you're going to somehow improve speed. But then you just forget about speed and you talk about memory. Okay, so that's a problem. Now, why do people do this? It's actually very natural because it's the way we think. Like you think about, okay, here's problem X. Okay, so here are the things that are relevant generally about problem X. Let me tell you about the algorithms. They're slow, they're memory inefficient, they're something, and they're something. Okay. Now, from these four things, let's focus on the memory consumption, and then we go talk about memory consumption. So it's a natural way to think, but it doesn't work in a paper. Okay. In a paper, you want to actually only state the things that are going to be relevant later to what you did. Okay, I'll return to this in a second. It's not a literature review where you cover all the different points. Another issue with a common mistake with shared context is that you give no direction at all. For example, you can say, computer science is concerned with the efficiency of algorithms. The famous P versus NP question crystallizes this by attempting to partition problems into those that can be solved in polytime and those that cannot. Many researchers believe P does not equal NP, and those two classes are distinct. But there's also a possibility that the two classes of algorithms are the same. In this paper, we'll look at the problem of inferring semantic meaning from English sentences and develop a polynomial time algorithm that uses machine learning based on syntactic annotations. So here, the start is not giving any direction. It's sort of too generic, and it's not specific enough to what you're going to be talking about. Now, yes, there's this connection that you'll have a polynomial time algorithm, but this is really not the shared context that would hint at where you're going, which is really a natural language processing problem. Okay. So the reader will with no direction, they kind of get lost. They're not motivated. They will kind of, even if you give them this later, they're still going to be left with the feeling that they don't really know what your paper is about. Third common mistake is assuming wrong schemas. So, for example, assuming your readers know more than they do, or the other way around. So here, this could be an example also of assuming a wrong schema where most people reading a computer science technical paper know about P not equal to NP. You don't have to explain it, re-explain it to them. Okay, so this is assuming your reader doesn't know something when they do. So you didn't get that they have the schema that you can just build on top of. Okay. You can have the opposite. You can sometimes assume that your readers knows more than they actually do and fail to give them the details that they need and the context that they need to understand your work. Finally, it's you can be too broad or too narrow in your shared context with respect to what your solution is going to be. So in my field in bioinformatics, an extreme case of this is that I might start my paper saying how important it is to cure cancer. And then in the end I say, well, there's this algorithm that kind of detects something that might be used for curing cancer, and I improved the time of the algorithm by 10%. Okay. So here, it's my opening is too broad because no one's going to believe me that my 10% improvement in this algorithm that may or may not be used as part of something is going to cure cancer. Okay. Um, the opposite also happens. Sometimes you might talk about how important runtime is in the shared context, but then in your when you give your solution, you say, well, we improve runtime and improve accuracy. Well, in that case, you were too narrow initially because the reader is going to walk away thinking, oh, they improved runtime, and it'll be completely lost on them that you also did something more. You improved accuracy. I want to return back to this notion of misdirection because it closely ties to what is a literature review. So this is a common mistake that we make is we treat our introductions as we treat the shared context as a literature review. Here I'll tell you everything that's been done on this before. Okay? And there is a lot of overlap between between the shared context of a introduction and a literature review, but there are important differences. So a literature review really has to cover everything that's known, right? That's your job. Okay. The shared context is ultimately focused on getting to the point of what is not known, right? You have a knowledge gap, for example, or a methods gap, and you want to take the reader there. Okay? And you want to describe how that fits into existing literature, but you have a narrow goal. Okay? And things that are not related to your end goal, you should not include. So here's an example, not the visualization that maybe helps you think about it. This is like a tree of a branching tree of like your literature review, right? You start, I have this problem, and there's like 3 different approaches, and in approach 1 there are 3 different types of algorithms, and for each algorithm there have been 3 types of papers that I've studied, and so you kind of go through this tree and explain everything. Okay. And what you work on has to do with this node right here. That's where your solution is. If you're doing in the lit review you have no solution, but in your research paper you have your solution right here. Okay, so you might be tempted to kind of prune the tree and sort of not talk about those things, just kind of touch upon them, and then get to your point here. But this is also how misdirection can happen, because as you're going over, like, okay, here's problem X, here's the runtime, here's the memory, here's the accuracy. If your work is on the memory, then this talking about runtime will be a misdirection. You really want something that looks more like this, like straight down to the point. And again, the way we naturally think about things maybe is like this. We think about, and often an initial draft will look something not like this, but my initial drafts will often look something like this. And what I then do is I see what my solution is, and I kind of just go back up and prune the tree that doesn't exist on this path. I only keep the part of the paper that has this path. Now, there's an external pressure for you to be credible. Remember, for you to cite the previous work and not offend anyone by excluding their citations. So sometimes these forces are pulling in different directions. Okay? So you need to cite certain papers. So how do you do it? Here's an example of what you might have written. Paper 1 solved problem X with approach A. Paper 2 solved it with approach B. Paper 3 with C. 4 with D. The approaches A and B fall into the category of machine learning, while approaches C and D fall into the category of graph theory. And you might say, look, I know this is kind of, looks more like this. Maybe what I'm going to talk about is just graph theory. But I need to cite these other papers. Well, then you can shorten what you're doing by grouping citations together. You can say there are different approaches to problem X, with some tools using machine learning, cite 1 and 2, and others using graph theory, cite 3 and 4. So you still cite everyone, but you leave out some of the details about the approaches, and thereby you shorten it just to one sentence. So that's the shared context. Now let's go to the second part, which is the statement of the problem. Now, a problem has two parts. The first is the condition or the situation in which brings about this problem. So we saw binge drinking, terrorism, or high running time, in no particular order here. But that condition or the situation then has a cost, has an intolerable consequence of it. The answer to the so what. Okay, and so it's important you don't assume that the cost is obvious to the reader. For example, maybe with binge drinking costs, a reader might say, maybe there are no costs. It's just kids being kids, and they'll grow out of it. So that's one problem. The reader says, oh, it's what you claim is a problem. I don't think is a problem. And then they're not going to like your paper. Even if they think it's a problem, they may have an answer to the question of so what that has nothing to do with what you're thinking about. So for example, the cost of binge drinking could be dangerous behavior, right? There are people getting killed. It could be that those kids are getting poor grades. It could be that it's a waste of money. Right? You get a college education and you spend it, you throw it away. Now, if you don't spell out the so what for the reader, they'll put in whatever they think. They will think, oh, the so what, it's dangerous behavior. But then you write your paper about how it affects poor grades and how we can improve the grades of students that have drinking problems. And the reader is going to say, wait a second, no, that's not an important that's not an important thing to look at. What you should have really looked at is dangerous behavior. So when you don't specify the cost, it leaves open the reader to invent their own cost and then be unhappy with your paper because it doesn't do what they expected. Okay. So this is actually a common problem, is that you assume that the cost is known. Like terror, I might describe, oh, they have problems with terrorism. And it might be obvious to me, okay, there's a cost to terrorism, right? I don't have to spell it out. Well, there's lots of different costs to terrorism. And so I do need to say which one I'm going to be talking about. And, more relevant to computer science, if your condition is high running time, well, you have to say, okay, so what? And sometimes, instead of 1 second, it takes 2 seconds. Or sorry, the other way around, right? It took 2 seconds, you're going to speed it up. But 2 seconds is, it's fine. I can wait 2 seconds. So you have to explain the so what. And say, well, with this 2 seconds happens in a very time-sensitive environment, and maybe it's happening a million times over and over again, or whatever it is. But you have to explain the cost. So what? Then there are different types of problems. Okay, there are practical versus conceptual problems. So a practical problem concerns a condition in the real world and asks for doing a physical action. Okay, so here the problem with binging is that it creates injury. Let's stop binging. Or it could be in computer science that you say the problem is that system X does not support feature Y. Let's create method Z to achieve Y in system X. Okay, so we have a practical problem, and we're creating a method that solves this problem. Sometimes in computer science we call this a methods gap. Okay, there's a gap in what is in principle could be done, in principle achievable. There's a gap between that and what we can actually do with existing methods. So those are practical problems. On the other hand, there are conceptual problems, and these concern just the way we think about something and what we're what the problem is, we don't understand something. Okay, so with binging, it could be we don't understand why students binge. Let's understand that. Okay, I'm not proposing any solution or something. I just want to understand binging. And sometimes here, instead of a method gap, we call this a knowledge gap. There's something we don't know, but would be nice to know. Okay, and we often express this as a question. So the condition here can be a question. Why do students binge drink? So what's the cost? Well, the cost is often tying into another larger question. Okay, so it's like a dissatisfaction of not understanding something important. For example, with binge drinking, we might say administrators do not know why students underestimate the risks of binge drinking. Okay, so that's the condition. Okay. Now the so what? Well, if they knew, they might figure out something more important. Would better information and orientation help students make safer decisions about drinking? Okay, so we're tying into a bigger question. This is very common in papers in the natural sciences, like biology, for example. You're often, interested in, why something evolved, and in your paper you maybe can't answer that big question, but you look at some kind of smaller subproblem, and then you say, well, if we know the answer to the smaller subproblem, we might be able to understand why humans have evolved in some way. Okay. So and sometimes computer science papers also have the knowledge gap instead of a methods gap. A good knowledge gap engages the curiosity aspect. And remember, this is that emotional aspect of a sticky story, the E. Okay, and you can engage it also with a methods gap, and we talked about, especially if it's not obvious that there is a method there that could work. Okay. Now we see this in both cases. We see this kind of like a funnel where we, in the end, what we do is pretty narrow, right? We answer this specific question or develop this method for this specific case, but we start with kind of a bigger issue. So let me go back to the binge drinking example. So in the end, the solution is we're going to educate students how to manage the risks. Okay. But what we start is binge drinking in general, and we're talking about there's 6 deaths and injuries and so on. Well, there's sort of a gap. We're not going to prevent those deaths right away, right? We're not saying, okay, here's how we're going to avoid any deaths associated with binge drinking. That's too ambitious right away. We are going to start with educating students, and hopefully that has some effect. So there's a funnel. We start with something big, and then we kind of go get narrow and narrow. And this is often happening in an introduction. You're funneling down. And there's a good way to do it and a bad way to do it. Here's an example of a bad way to do it. This is an example from bioinformatics. You might say in the beginning, being able to computationally predict the structure of a protein with high accuracy will revolutionize medicine. Okay. And then in your solution, you say, in this paper, we improve the accuracy of existing methods by 1% on some proteins. Okay. So no, you did not revolutionize medicine by doing this, right? So there's a gap. Your funnel went from big to very small quickly, and here the reader gets The reader doesn't like this. The reader thinks things feels like they've been fooled. Now, it may be that this is actually a big deal. This 1% is a big deal, but you have to explain it to them, to the reader. So here's what you could do is insert these B and C in between this A and D. So you'd say, okay, being able to predict will revolutionize medicine. However, the field has been stuck, with the most accurate algorithm being over 5 years old. In fact, even for low complexity instances, there has not been improvements. And then in this paper, we improved the accuracy of existing methods by 1% on some proteins. Now you've funneled, you don't have just big and large, you kind of narrowed it down in a way that makes sense. So now the reader says, okay, no, I understand you did not revolutionize medicine, but there's been no progress at all, even on some proteins, and you're made that step that's been the first one in 5 years. So you're clearly contributing to this bigger issue. But the key there is to have these intermediate challenges that show naturally how your solution actually does relate to the bigger problem. So what are the common mistakes with stating the problem? Okay. One is a failure to identify the problem. Okay, it might, once I kind of present it like this, it might seem silly, but no, this happens all the time. So you might say, if you're doing wireless networking, there has been very little work in integrating fairness schemes into wireless networks. And then go on how you do something like this. Well, if you didn't explain why fairness schemes are important, why they should be integrated, then you're basically proposing a solution. You're going to propose a solution to a problem which you didn't state. You just kind of assumed. You just said, well, there's been little work on doing something. And you just assume, well, it's important to be doing work on that. But no, you didn't state a problem. And so going back to the types of readers you have, if it's a reader in your area, dedicated reader, they're not gonna have any issue with this, because they've worked on integrating fairness schemes, and they know how important it is. But someone a little bit outside of that area is gonna read this and say, oh, I don't want to read this further. Why? Who cares about fairness schemes in wireless networks? Okay. So even though you develop some kind of algorithms, no one's motivated to understand the algorithm. Another common mistake is you offer a solution before you define the problem. So you say, for example, our algorithm will allow wireless network users streaming high-priority Zoom calls to not be interrupted by background updates to their operating systems. You are stating the problem, okay, that people are interrupted by during Zoom calls, but you're doing it after you're presenting what your solution is. So the danger here is that you haven't built up. I think you're losing some of the success elements of your story. When you first give a problem, the reader thinks, oh wow, okay, that's a problem. And then you kind of also say that, okay, the current methods don't work, or what the limitations are. You define the methods gap. And by that point, the reader is like, wow, okay, yeah, so we have a problem. And then you hit them with we solved it. And that's maybe unexpected. Maybe that's cool. They're at that point very ready to hear that, and it sticks in their minds what you did. If it's the other way around, then you kind of didn't build this up. And the reader will say, okay, well, I guess they have an algorithm. Oh yeah, okay, I guess that's important. But it's not the same. Finally, a third common mistake is that you're not concrete enough. Remember, that was one of the sticky elements. You might say, this algorithm will allow some wireless users to greatly benefit. you can be more specific, more concrete. You can say, well, this will allow, so and so users in such and such situations to decrease the number of interruptions by 70%. Okay. Something like that sticks, like the 70% sticks in readers' mind. Whereas this is very generic, and someone will read this and say, okay, sure, whatever. Finally, we're getting to the solution. Okay, so, and here you state things in different way depending on if you have a practical problem or a conceptual problem. In a practical problem, the solution is to do something or to have a method that does something. Okay, so back to the example of the binge drinking, we may not be able to stop binging entirely, but we must try to control its worst costs by educating students in how to manage risks. So we're going to do something, we're going to educate students. Or we designed and implemented an algorithm to add feature Y to system X. In conceptual problems, the solution is often about adding some knowledge. So for example, in the binge drinking, this study reports on our analysis of the beliefs of 300 first-year college students. We found that students were more likely to binge if they knew more stories of other students binging, so that they believe that binging is far more common than it actually is. Okay, so here now we've understood something. We had a knowledge gap that we closed. Okay, and so that's our solution. Okay, we didn't do anything. I mean, we did our study, but we didn't do anything to actually address the binge drinking problem yet. In computer science, you might say, we studied how method X affects performance and found that in some cases it's good and in other cases it's bad. Okay, with obviously you would put in here something more specific than this. But here it's a study of an algorithm's performance. You didn't design a new method, but you added some knowledge that was important. Now, the book talks about common elements of a prelude. Okay, and that's something that's not common in CNS writing, but sometimes happen, and you'll see it in other places too. Okay. This is like a catchy way to start the intro. It could be a quotation, it could be a startling fact, or it could be an illustrative anecdote. Just something to really catch the reader's attention. Okay. It's not widely used in computer science, and it can be frowned upon. And I think if you don't do this carefully, it's very easy to be very cliche, and it's better to avoid this in general unless you really think it's gonna work. But here's an example of a prelude that really does all of these three things. It is often said that if you're old enough to fight for your country, you're old enough to drink to it. Tragically, Jim S., president of Omega Alpha, no longer has a chance to do either. When he accepted a dare from his fraternity brothers to down a pint of whiskey in one long swallow, he didn't expect to become this year's 8th college fatality from alcohol poisoning. And then, so this is the prelude, and then you go on to your shared context. According to a recent study, 3 out of 4 students have blah, blah, blah. But here you have this very catchy, very memorable prelude, and it has everything. It has the quotation, it has a startling fact that this Jim S. Passed away, and it's an illustrative anecdote of your bigger point. So that kind of gets us closer to the end of this lecture. But one objection that I think sometimes people have is like, but I feel like pigeonholed by following this. Can't I be creative? Can't I, do something that really works well? Like I can state the problem before the shared context, and well, sometimes you can. Sometimes you could do things in a different way. The problem is that you do not have a captive reader, and the reader, remember, has expectations. So if you violate the reader's expectation and they're not dedicated, you might lose them completely. Right? If especially people that are not going to spend a lot of time on your paper, they're going to skim. And when they're skimming, they're really skimming because they're expecting certain things in certain places, and they're using that to skim. For example, if I'm skimming a bioinformatics paper, I will be very, very quick from the first two paragraphs because I assume this is the shared context and I already know all this stuff. Okay, so I basically skip it. I spend a second on it. If the reader decides to put something important in there, like something about what they actually did, about the solution, then yeah, it may work if I sat down and read it from start to finish, but it doesn't work when I'm skimming because I'm not going to see it in those first two paragraphs. So it's good to follow this template. Now, as you get more experience, you might make some strategic deviations, and sometimes this can work, right? But especially if you're inexperienced, it's safer to stick to the template. And not only that, what often happens is you don't deviate from the template strategically or on purpose. You deviate because you didn't try to fit things into the template. Okay, so it is good to follow the template. Now let's touch briefly on the conclusion. Okay, so in computer science, we often mix these discussion and conclusion up together, and often it's a very short part of the paper. In life sciences, these are two separate sections, and like the discussion is considered probably the most important part of the paper. But in computer science, we tend to put these together. So I'll just think of it as a conclusion. We start often with the short version of the challenge. Like we already talked about it in the intro, so we're not going to need to explain everything again. We just maybe have a sentence or two where we reiterate, and then we summarize what we've done in the methods and results. However, when you're summarizing the action in the intro, you're limited because the reader hasn't yet learned your terminology that you're going to use. They don't know the details. They know kind of very little from what you said in the intro, and you have to explain what you did, limited by those concepts. Now in the conclusion, you can restate what you did, but now using all the things that the reader would have learned as they read your methods and results. And now you get to your resolution after this. Okay, so this is a very long version of the so what. You had the so what question, like why do we need this to close this knowledge gap? Why do we need a method? Okay, but now you can elaborate much more. You can take it further. You can say, well, this is, instead of so what, this is, okay, now what? Okay, we did it. Okay, now we have this method. Okay, now what? What can be done with it? Where are the new directions? And this is the one place in the paper where you're given some leeway to speculate, to kind of not be very precise or very concise about supporting every statement you have with evidence. You could make a hypothesis. You could say, I think that, it's going to be important for the field to do this and that. So this kind of stuff has its place in the conclusion. Okay, so that's it for the lecture today.